Hi, welcome back. Okay, so I left off last time. Um, we had gone through some basic principles of Wu uh, Confucianism, focusing on Kǒngzǐ, Confucius. Um, we first looked at the Analects, and then we looked at the two other. Well, we didn't get to the second one. We were going to look at two other um, uh, texts of founding texts of Wu um, the Da the Great Learning, which we did look at. We got to a couple of passages from that, and then we were going to look at the Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Mean. And we didn't get to that, but you can look at ctext.org. It's some of the passages I mentioned in the slide. Actually, I can go back to it. It's not letting me go back to it. Oh, wait, what happened? That's not good. Hi, I'm back. I don't know why the PowerPoint slide wouldn't go back to this. The PowerPoint wouldn't go back to this slide. So I had to pause and reopen it. But anyway, you see that there are various other passages that we didn't have a chance to go through. Perhaps the one thing that I should mention from that is the emphasis on sincerity, which is aligning your shin, which Xin, which is heart or mind, seat of intellect and seat of emotion, aligning that with the facts, with the condition of things, with this condition of the world, so that those are not out of kilter, they're not disaligned with one another. And I'll leave it to you to think about how that fits into the whole hierarchical sequence of that we discussed of how to develop personal integrity, familial propriety, and flourishing of the larger society, the way those are all connected with one another, and how sincerity could fit in there. And indeed, we'll touch on that some in the one remaining element of one remaining aspect of Kǒngzǐ's teaching that I want to turn to, which is the rectification of names, Zhengming, which is the first bullet point here. There we go. Okay, now, all right. Mostly today we're going to focus on subsequent Wu thinkers, two of them in particular, especially Mèngzǐ, but also to some extent Xúnzǐ, and we'll touch on a third much later, a Song Dynasty Wu theorist, though we won't address him in much detail. Since I've gone over on earlier lectures, I'm thinking that I'm going to try to keep this one a little shorter, but we'll see what happens. I want to go over rectification of names because, as you'll see, this is a doctrine that is specifically criticized in Taoism. And so it's important to have this contextual background, this emphasis on the rectification of names in Wu Shui. By the way, given the very good, the very thoughtful and thought-provoking responses I've gotten from you, it struck me that I should just re-emphasize that as in Kǒngzǐ, the zi at the end, is a actually we'll see it in this passage. Is a suffix meaning master. So instead of putting the word master before somebody's name, you put it at the end as a suffix in Chinese. And it's a suffix of respect. Again, translated usually as master. The reason, so Mèngzǐ, Kǒngzǐ, Master Kong, Mèngzǐ, Master Meng, Xúnzǐ, Master Xun. The reason I just want to note it now is that you always know you're talking about a person. It's an easy way of recognizing that you're talking about a person. And also it's like beginning it with master. If you want to know which person you're talking about, you don't listen to the last part, the zi, because that everybody has in common. You listen to the first part, Meng, Kong, Shun, whatever. Okay, so we do our usual thing, looking at Lun Yu is the analects. And so, I think it was 13.3, wasn't it? Yeah, 13.3, but I also want to look briefly at 13.1 and 2. So we go to 13. Zilu. Zilu is one of Kǒngzǐ's followers who asks him questions and responds not always very smartly, as you'll see in 13.3. I want to just note the Chinese here. This sort of double rectangle that you can look up, and as you can see, it's yue, a verb meaning to say, and it introduces it follows a name identifying who's speaking in a dialogue. And in the analects, even though a number of other characters or people in the dialogue are referred to as master such and such, commonly, maybe always, I'm not sure it's always, but I think it might be always, Kǒngzǐ is just referred to as master. So being the master, the paradigmatic master, he doesn't need another name in the analects. And zi is this character here. So zi yue, the master says, that'll just help orient you a little when you're trying to look at Chinese with the English. So since this is only the third item in this chapter, we'll briefly look at the first two. It isn't clear whether the immediate context, the immediately surrounding segments of the analects provide any sort of interpretive context. So some people think that it makes sense to read a given passage in relation to the passages that precede and follow. Others don't. I'm not sure, but it's worth looking at the two preceding ones briefly before going on here, although again I don't want to use enormous amounts of time because we have to get on to Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ. So the first, Zilu asked about government. The master said, "Go before the people with your example and be laborious in their affairs. He requested further instruction and was answered, "Be not weary in these things." I think this is worth noting. The Kǒngzǐ is again repeating the idea that his focus is not on whipping the people into shape. His focus is on providing exemplary virtue. So you behave as a junzi, as the gentleman, as it's usually translated, the superior person. The exemplary person is really perhaps the best way, conceptually the best way of translating it. You follow propriety, you behave with deference to those above, and empathy and forgiveness to those below, and so on. And in doing so, you will provide an example for the people. And if you treat people as they morally should be treated, and are always acting with propriety yourself, and with ren, humanity, which again comprises loyalty or respect and empathy. If you do that yourself, the idea is the people will themselves, they'll reform themselves, they'll behave properly following your example, and you won't have to whip them into shape with punishments. The second one, Zhonggong, being chief minister to the head of the Ji family, asked about government. So you can see the context here is talking about government. The master said, "Employ first the services of your various officers, pardon small faults, and raise to office men of virtue and talents." It's very simple advice, but it's basically advice saying, be humane, pardon small faults, again, fits with shu, which can translate as empathy, and I've emphasized empathy, but it can also translate as forgiveness. And raise to office men of virtue and talents. So, again, exemplars, people who have virtue, so that they are ethically upright, morally upstanding, but also talent, so they can do the job properly. This is opposed to people who are corrupt, in the first instance, corrupt versus virtuous. These are people, again, who have ren, humanity, and will serve, going back to 13.1, will serve as exemplars for the people. But they also have talents, which is to say that they are competent to perform their job properly. This in a context where many people would be inclined to promote officers solely on the basis of contacts and lineage, whether you were of a noble family or not. And this is again related to the entire development starting in the Han Dynasty, which again immediately follows the Qin. It's the first long-standing imperial dynasty, and one of the high points, one of the exemplary periods of Chinese culture, historically admired as an historical, one of the golden ages of Chinese tradition. The exam system began to develop in the Han Dynasty, and provided a way of moving out of your class, the class you were born into. And again, you remember as I talked about before, that the Han Dynasty, this all, of course, post-dates Kǒngzǐ by centuries, but it's in keeping with Kǒngzǐ's teaching. You may remember that the Han Dynasty was founded by someone who was not of royal lineage, but a peasant. Okay, so I'm not going to read the rest of 13.2. I'm going to go on to 13.3, which you'll see, as I told you, a number of Confucian passages have a similar sort of structure. We've looked at one previously. This is, to do A, you need B. To do E, you need D. To do D, you need C. To do C, and so on. Then you get down to A, and then A gives you B, B gives you C, C gives you D, D gives you E. That sort of structure. We've seen one case of it, and this is another. Zi said, "The ruler of Wei has been waiting for you in order with you to administer the government." Kind of weirdly phrased in English. "What will you consider the first thing to be done?" The master replied, "What is necessary is to rectify names." So to rectify names means to align names with things, with the situation in the world. Note that this is like the alignment of one's feelings with one's thoughts with nature, aligning one's in sincerity, aligning one's feelings and thoughts with nature is, of course, in another terminology common to the main philosophical schools of Chinese thought. If this were a face-to-face class, I'd ask what's another way you would phrase what you're doing if you align your shin, your heart or mind, with the nature of things. And then maybe one of you would say, following the Tao, and I would say, yes, exactly. Because all of these are instances of following Tian Dao, the way of heaven, the morally and cognitively and emotionally and naturally right way of acting, which will turn up again with different consequences, of course, in Taoism, which will begin in the next lecture. Anyway, this alignment of names, rectification of names, the alignment of names, and the nature of things is the sort of is an objective correlate of sincerity. Both are a matter of following the Tao, getting on the right path. "So, indeed," said Zi, "you are wide of the mark. Why must there be such rectification?" So Zi plays the sort of dopey role here that the master can respond to. He maybe plays the role of, say, a Taoist, even though he doesn't give a specific reason for disputing the master's claims here. But his skepticism about names is in keeping with Taoism, for example, or in aspects of Buddhism, but Buddhism doesn't come for many centuries after this, doesn't come into China for many centuries after this, so he couldn't be alluding to Buddhism. But he could potentially, the text couldn't be alluding to an early form of what developed into Taoism. Anyway, the master says, "How uncultivated you are. You, a superior man in regard to what he does not know, shows a cautious reserve." So you might guess, again, if this were a face-to-face class, I'd say, what do you think superior man translates? And if you guessed Zhunzi, you would be right. Here, again, as I mentioned, this character here is Zi. So if you want to see if something may be Zhunzi, an easy thing to skim through looking for is that Zi. And then you look here and you may not remember that's Zhun, but you can highlight it and double click on it and have it looked up, and you'll see it's Zhunzi, that those two characters together are Zhunzi, the superior man, which turns up again in relation to Ming names in this subsequent sentence later in the passage, unsurprisingly. Because again, one way of thinking about the Zhunzi is as the person who is sincere, is the person who gets the names right, is the person who serves as an exemplar, is the person who follows Tiandao, the way of heaven. Those are all ways of thinking about the Zhunzi. Okay, so back to the passage. By the way, I should also emphasize that I go through these passages in such detail because this sort of explication, in my opinion, is extremely important. I think it's important to have the big picture, because without the big picture, you can't do the concrete interpretation. But I think the concrete interpretation is really important because that gives you the specificity of the big picture. It works out in detail. What is sometimes called functionalizes. It makes operational. It gives you a concrete sense of what the general ideas mean. And to a great extent, the tests in the class will involve me giving you passages and you going through them in this sort of detail that I'm going through in class. Well, not in class, but in these lectures that would be taking place in class if we were in class. Okay. So where was I? Okay, a superior man with regard to what he does not know shows a cautious reserve. This is a really nice statement because it indicates that the Zhunzi is not omniscient. The Zhunzi is following the Tiandao, but hasn't necessarily reached the end of the Tiandao, hasn't reached the end of the journey. You should still be self-critical. In fact, that's part of being a Zhunzi, is being self-critical, knowing your limits, recognizing that you have limits, and having a cautious reserve, meaning you may have skepticism about a particular idea, and you can be cautious about that, and that's good, but you should also be cautious about your own skepticism. Self-critical as well as wary of misunderstanding. So then we go on. I'll just read the passage and then I'll go back. If names be not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried to success. Well, I'll go back to it. Affairs cannot be carried to success. When affairs cannot be carried on to success, proprieties and music will not flourish. When proprieties and music do not flourish, punishments will not be properly awarded. When punishments are not properly awarded, the people do not know how to move hand or foot. Therefore, a superior man considered, that is a Zhunzi. Again, you can find it, as I noted. Considers it necessary that the names he uses be spoken appropriately, and also that what he speaks may be carried out appropriately. What the superior man requires is just that in his words there may be nothing incorrect. I think this is a really interesting passage. It's intrinsically interesting, but it's also valuable by its contrast with Taoism, which just repudiates this entirely. The Tao Te Ching indicates that this sort of, that in Lao Tzu's view, this is just completely misguided. And I'm much more sympathetic with Kǒngzǐ myself, but anyway, so let's start at the beginning. If names be not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. Okay, so what does that mean? The sort of first thing that might occur to you is just like getting a word wrong. Like you're speaking a foreign language and you say oven when you mean refrigerator or something. And of course, what you say then won't be in accord with the truth of things. But that's not terribly interesting. That's not terribly significant. I mean, it can be significant if it leads to practical miscommunication. But that's not what he's focusing on here. Again, the first two passages in Book 13 of the Analects both referred to government, and this passage number 3, the context of it is the ruler of Wei has been waiting for you with you to administer the government. What will you consider the first thing to be done? So the context is all administration or government. And so the implication, the context implies that the first sort of speech you're concerned with here is governmental speech, what the government says. So, so for example, what the emperor says or what an administrator says. In the United States today, what the president announces in a press conference, what the State Department releases in some official document. Those sorts of things are the primary case of speech that is being addressed in this passage. And so in that context, again, if this were a face-to-face class, I'd ask you, what are some cases where names would not be correct, words would not be in accordance with the nature of things? And if you've read, say, 1984 or seen a movie of the Orwell novel, or even just heard a summary of it, it provides a number of examples. Newspeak, the language of the 1984, the country in 1984, is designed to obscure the truth so that ordinary people will not rebel against or object to disobey the government. You can think of many contemporary cases of this sort of thing. Say, the use of the word terrorism. Who is referred to as a terrorist and who isn't. To take an obvious example, the Black Lives Matter protesters, the overwhelming majority of whom are not doing anything violent. There is some fringe person who, say, throws a brick through a window. And it's very easy for someone then to label the whole group terrorists. On the other hand, a white person comes with an assault rifle and shoots protesters, such a person is obviously engaging technically in terrorism, but might be referred to as defending law and order or something. That would be more the sort of case that this passage refers to. It's a case where a characterization of one group of people as terrorists and another as defenders of law and order misrepresents the situation. And given that it misrepresents the situation in really politically highly consequential ways, everything that follows in the passage is, you can see exactly how, I think you can see exactly how it would work out. So if names be not correct, language is not in accord with the truth of things, because you've characterized murder as defense of law and order. And for the vast majority of the group, you've characterized protest against murder as terrorism, which is completely out of keeping with the actual situation. I say, speaking to you right now from Wisconsin, ironically enough, although not anywhere near Kenosha. If language be not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on to success. So the work undertaken by governmental administration, the advancement of society, the prospering of society, the good of society can't be accomplished. You can't achieve that when you've so mischaracterized the initial situation. When affairs cannot be carried to success, proprieties in music will not flourish. I have to admit, I'm all in favor of music. Music is great, I'm certainly not critical of music, though quite the contrary. Although I have to admit I've never fully understood it's kind of nice the way Kǒngzǐ emphasizes the moral impact of music, but I have to say I've never really understood it. But he believes that music has morally beneficial effects. So that's why music is there. Proprieties, of course, means behaving according to principle, behaving with humanity, behaving in the way that the junzi behaves. And you're not going to have a government of junzi, a government of exemplars, a government of people, of leaders that the ordinary people will want to imitate and can imitate in order to themselves become junzi, in order for themselves to follow Tiandao, the path of heaven. That won't happen when you've allowed language to become dissociated from the facts. And with language becoming dissociated from the facts, ending the possibility of fulfilling the goals of the moral and practical goals of government. So that's what it means for the proprieties in music to flourish. When proprieties in music do not flourish, punishments will not be properly awarded. this is usually not translated, or often, sometimes it's translated as punishments, sometimes translated as penalties. The crucial thing here, you may say, well, I thought Kǒngzǐ didn't believe in punishments, and he mostly doesn't. But that's why it's important that this follows the passage on propriety, following principle. Because if the leaders follow principle and are junsa and are exemplars for the rest of the people, then the ordinary people will follow principle too. But if you have leadership that is not following the tiandao, that is not following the proper way, the way of heaven, then the people won't follow the way of heaven either. And because the people aren't following the way of heaven, then the issue of penalizing the people for misconduct arises. But since we've already established that due to this chain of events leading back to misrepresentation of the world because you haven't rectified names, because of this chain of events leading back to that mischaracterization, deceit, misrepresentation, because of that misleading, this sort of initial deceit or deception, falsity, because of that, the people administering the penalties are not themselves following the way of heaven, and thus they won't administer penalties appropriately. So to go back to the Kenosha case, if the government is characterizing the murderer as a defender of law and order and peaceful protesters as terrorists, then there's a good chance that penalties for the misbehavior that in fact occurred will not be given out appropriately. Ideally, in a Confucian system, you wouldn't reach the point where you needed to give penalties because everything would have been solved already by the exemplary behavior of those in charge, whom we could all admire, look up to, and imitate as they are junsa, as they are superior, as they are exemplars. But given that that wasn't the case, there was misbehavior, there was criminality, and that leads to penalties. But the very situation that gave rise to the misbehavior also means that the penalties won't be awarded properly. And if they're not awarded properly, the people will not know how to move hand or foot. They won't know what to do. If nonviolence is treated as murder, if walking to your car where your kids are is treated as something that merits being shot in the back 7 times, then what do you do? It's everything is just too confusing. It certainly doesn't seem that walking to the car where your kids are is something that should get you shot in the back 7 times, or even once. But that's what happens. So the people, again, won't know how to move hand or foot because anything can be punished and you don't know beforehand. Therefore, a junsa, a superior man, considers it necessary that the names he uses be spoken appropriately, and also that what he speaks be carried out appropriately. What the superior man requires is just that in his words there may be nothing incorrect. I've gone on at such length on this, I'm just going to stop on that so we can go on to Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ, because I think the rest of the passage is fairly self-explanatory given what I said before that. Hi, I had to pause. You don't even know that. Just struck me. Anyway, I almost forgot to mention some. I just wanted to emphasize in 13.2 this pardon small faults passage or statement, which may seem, it's significant because it has to do with forgiveness and so on that we mentioned, and thus empathy, shu. But it turns up in legalism, which will be coming a little later. Okay, so so much for Kǒngzǐ per se. Oh, there's Xin, the heart, mind, seat of intellect and emotion. So the two main figures that in Ru Shui that come in the somewhat in proximity to Kǒngzǐ is his sort of they're sort of the next major generation of Ru Shui thinkers. Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ are kind of polar opposites in many ways and represent opposed tendencies within Ru Shui. Mèngzǐ has been also usually his name is usually transliterated as Mencius, Mencius, and his the text that presents his thought is called the Mèngzǐ or the Mencius. Mencius, it's there. He has become canonical within Ru Shui. In other words, he's sort of widely recognized as the legitimate heir of Kǒngzǐ. Xúnzǐ is, you only read about Xúnzǐ if you sort of make a point of it. He isn't canonical in Ru Shui. He's certainly canonical in the history of Chinese philosophy. He's certainly an important figure there. And he's recognized as a figure in Ru Shui, but he doesn't have... In the Sung dynasty, for example, when the classics, what counted as a classic of Chinese tradition was reconfigured, Kǒngzǐ was, his analects were, of course, included. Well, actually, why don't I just add the Jushi is a much later Confucian thinker, Neo-Confucian thinker, as he's often referred to, from the southern Sung dynasty, which we won't be turning to until much later, for another several weeks. But historically after Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ, he's sort of the fourth great figure in the history of Confucian thought of Ru Shui, and he redid the classics, and as he sort of pared them down, stressing 4 rather than the 9 that were often referred to previously. And those 4 are the Da Shui and the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, Dongyong, the 2 that we talked about last time, Kǒngzǐ's Lunyu, the Analects, and the Mèngzǐ, so the writings of Mèngzǐ. As you can see, Xúnzǐ is not included here. On the other hand, Xúnzǐ had enormous political influence, in part because 2 of his students were among the founders of legalism, a very harsh and fairly obviously anti-Confucian tendency that has had significant practical... It's usually... what everybody says about legalism is that it dominated the Qin dynasty, so, it wasn't even for 2 decades, and then it was repudiated. And that's sort of true in the sense that it was repudiated in name. You basically didn't refer to yourself as following Han Feizi or Lüsse or the other legalist theorists. And we'll turn to them briefly in another couple of lectures. I won't spend much time on them, though I will return to them in the context of the UN drama. But anyway, as I say, the commonplace is that they, so to speak, ruled the roost. They were the dominant political philosophy during the Qin dynasty, which was, again, very short-lived, not even 2 decades, and then were repudiated. But that repudiation in name did not go along with the repudiation in fact. Legalism, with its harsh measures, its very anti-Confucian punishment emphasis, has been a recurring theme in Chinese government for millennia. So it hasn't died out, and quite the contrary, has been very influential. And it was again founded by Xúnzǐ's students, although Xúnzǐ himself probably would have been deeply distressed by the extremity of legalism. But you can see, as you'll be able to see in a little bit, how legalism, well, once we get to legalism, you might be able to see how it would develop out of Xúnzǐ's ideas. Anyway, okay, so the basic difference, just to really simplify, the basic difference between Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ is that Mèngzǐ thought human beings were good, and basically good, and that even though they were because they were basically good, all that you had to do with human beings is to prevent them from being corrupted. Stuff happens in life that can distort your natural inclinations, and it's those distortions that produce bad behavior, that produce impropriety, that produce immorality. Xúnzǐ had more or less the opposite view. He felt that human beings started out mostly bad. They had some good qualities, but he actually, we'll look at a passage where he just basically says people are bad. In fact, that might be literally what he says. We'll see when we get to the passage. So even though there are some, they have some good points, and so you have to strive to to develop those good points and to overcome the evil inclinations, and that can involve punishment for expressing the evil inclinations, for acting on the evil inclinations. And you can see how legalism, a harsh, authoritarian, severely punitive regime, you can see how that might develop out of a presumption that human nature is bad, and the natural tendency toward evil has to be suppressed. Anyway, so turning to Mèngzǐ, I had initially planned on just going through the passages in Mèngzǐ in this C-text version that we've been looking at, but I'm not going to do that because for some reason the Legge, that's the translator of the C-text version, organizes the text differently than everybody else does, so that it's hard to find the passages that I want us to talk about. I did identify some of them. So, for example, we'll talk about passage what's usually identified as 1b6, and in the C-text version, you look at chapter Liang Hui Wang, part 2, number 13. That corresponds to what's usually labeled 1b6. But as you can see, that it's not easy to find. So I've given this other link here, and you can follow the you can follow that link to a more accessible version. And we'll probably look mostly at that. But anyway, since I have the Lunyu open, the Analects, I know I keep saying I'm not going to do any more with the Analects, and then I keep going back to it. But I want to do one more passage with the Lunyu because it bears on 17.2. It bears on the difference between Xúnzǐ and Mèngzǐ. So we want to go to 17, Analects 17.2. The master said, by nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they get to be wide apart. Nearly alike is often translated as close to one another, or proximate to one another, or interrelated with one another. That isn't the way it's translated, but it could be. So the idea is that in nature, we all, this is the way it's often interpreted. It's a kind of ambiguous statement in and of itself, but it's often interpreted to mean that we are naturally inclined to connect to one another. So by nature, human beings are gregarious, are friendly, or companionable. I mean, none of those words is literally what the Chinese says, but I mean, it says close to, mutually close is basically what the Chinese says. But what does mutually close mean? It can mean, as I say, compatible, companionable, gregarious, friendly, social, inclined to bond with one another, whatever. But by practice, by action, in effect, by cultivation, they come to be separated from one another. So by nature, we'd connect to one another. It's only because of the way society is, that society deviates from the Tiandao, that we are split apart from one another. And so I want to note that in connection with what we're going to be looking at in Mèngzǐ. And in Mèngzǐ, since I don't know how much of this we'll get to, I want to note that I'm going to emphasize 3 points. The main thing I'm going to focus on in Mèngzǐ is his stress on empathy. He really brings out the idea of empathic bonding between human beings as being the natural source of our similarity or bonding or companionability, our being close together by nature. And it's what happens when we misbehave, when we deviate from the Tiandao, is that our natural empathy has been compromised. It's been harmed by something in society. And again, that is not what you get in Xúnzǐ. Xúnzǐ does not emphasize empathy. He emphasizes correct behavior. And you can see how someone who thinks of empathy or compassion as the definitive property of being ethical, of being virtuous, someone could think that that's natural, whereas someone who thinks that the definitive property is of virtue is proper behavior would think that it has to be inculcated. And that's basically the difference between Mèngzǐ and Xúnzǐ. They really stress very different things. In keeping with his, and define virtue, understand virtue in very different ways. In keeping with his focus on the innate goodness of humanity, the nature of our heart-mind always to be compassionate and empathic, as long as it isn't distorted by upbringing or social systems that deviate from the Tiandao. A number of things follow in Mengzí's system of thought. One is that he, like Kǒngzǐ, he emphasizes the importance of obedience and deference and respect to those higher in the hierarchy, and beneficence and forgiveness to those lower in the hierarchy. But he's explicit in allowing that someone who's high in the hierarchy, who does not serve as an exemplar for the rest of society, who does not, a ruler, for example, who does not follow Tiandao, the way of heaven, does not merit being monarch. Since that person does not merit being monarch, it is right to rebel against that person. So revolution is actually explicitly permitted by Mengzǐ, despite despite the general respect that Ru Shui has for social order. Mengzǐ says that, again, I can ask, if there's a face-to-face class, I'd say to you, what would Mengzǐ say that a dissolute ruler has lost? And you would probably, most of you, maybe all of you, would respond that ruler had lost the Tianming, had lost the mandate of heaven. And Mengzǐ doesn't require any further proof of losing the mandate of heaven. Just seeing that the ruler is not behaving in an exemplary fashion, is not a junsa, is not following the Tiandao, the path of heaven, the way of heaven, is enough to condemn that ruler as someone who has lost the mandate of heaven and therefore does not deserve the monarchy, the rulership. Finally, his emphasis on empathy also leads him to advocate land reform. For example, the well-field system, which I mentioned before, which limits the taxation imposed on small on small farmers, on the peasantry, limits the taxation on the peasantry, gives them equal amounts of land, and gives some portion of land for communal cultivation that will serve for the taxation system. It's a kind of proto-social. It isn't exactly socialist, but maybe, land reform. If it happened today, we think of it not as socialism, but as socialist influenced. And that sort of concern for the entirety of the society, that sort of empathic concern, the suffering of the peasantry due to unequal distribution of land, lack of land ownership, excessive taxation, and so on. Those sorts of things, the compassion for, the empathy with the ordinary people are all consequences of Mengzí's stress on empathy as central to, as the key aspect of virtue, and his making it particularly central to Ru Shui. Okay, so let's look at a couple of passages. I'm going to do this slightly out of order because 2a6 is the one that I want to be sure to get to, and that's at Gongsun Zhou 1:6. So we go to Gongsun Sunzhou 1 and then go down to 6. It's sort of lengthy. I'm gonna will that still fit on? Yeah, it'll still fit on if I expand it a little. Okay. Mèngzǐ said, all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. This is enormously important. Here's that word xin, the heart or mind. Those 3 little lines there are indicative of liquid, in this case blood, relating to the heart. It's a character that you might want to remember just because it turns up in important places. And Ren, this one for human, is also worth remembering. And by the way, you can translate, this isn't, there's nothing in this that says that these are male. So he's, Legge, the translator, is just following the convention of the time when he was writing to use men rather than people. A translator today would probably say all people, because it is not a sex-marked passage. It clearly means men and women, and boys and girls, because it's not age-marked either. So all people basically have a mind which cannot bear to see the suffering of others, a mind or heart that cannot bear to see the sufferings of others. That is for Mèngzǐ our natural condition. Our natural condition is, well, for Xúnzǐ our natural condition is focusing on ourselves and being selfish and only wanting stuff for ourselves. For Mèngzǐ, our natural condition is whenever we look at somebody else and they're suffering, we can't bear it. They're probably both true. It's just intuitively. Most of the time we're focused on ourselves, but when we see somebody suffering, it hurts. We feel badly. So in a sense, they're both right. We have both tendencies. But Mèngzǐ emphasized the empathic sensitivity as our natural virtue, the natural virtue with which we're endowed. So the ancient kings had this commiserating mind. And again, mind here, xin, is heart or mind. Disposition might be a way of translating it, although that's a bit abstract. So commiserating, we had the ancient kings. The ancient kings he's referring to here are those legendary kings that I mentioned at the beginning of the semester. Wait a minute, is this gonna, yeah. It's not that far from the beginning of the semester. But the legendary kings Yao, Shun, and Yu, that I mentioned on this slide here, the sage kings who were moral exemplars, those are the ancient kings he's referring to. They serve as models for thinking about virtue for numerous traditions, including the Ru Shui tradition. So the ancient kings, those sage kings, had this commiserating mind, a disposition, a heart that felt for others, a disposition to share others' sufferings. That's why they were exemplars, in Mèngzí's opinion. And they, as a matter of course, had likewise a commiserating government. That's to say that they were sage kings, that they had that these were idyllic times, that this was a sort of utopian society that they ruled over. It's precisely because they cultivated their natural tendency to commiserate, their natural tendencies toward empathy and compassion. Their natural tendencies represented in our inability to bear the sufferings of others. In other words, this emphasis on nature is also in keeping with the Tian Dao, because the one recurring idea in Chinese tradition, it comes out particularly in Taoism, but you do also get it in Rushui, is that the Tian Dao is actually our most intimate, our most natural tendency. Following the Dao is not something you have to learn about, is not being artificial. In fact, following the Tao is what you would do naturally, and if you deviate from the Tao, from the Tian Dao, the path of heaven, then you've been somehow diverted from your natural course. Again, Xúnzǐ clearly doesn't believe that, but that's a recurring idea that Mèngzǐ has. Mèngzǐ shares with the Taoists. Where was I? When with a commiserating mind was practiced a commiserating government, to rule the kingdom was as easy a matter as to make anything go round in the palm. I don't know what go round in the palm means, but the idea is that it just follows automatically that if you act compassionately, you will be, as a ruler, you will be a sage king, and you will have an ideal society. And you can see how this fits with all the other things that we've derived, the things that we derived from our reading of Kǒngzǐ. And again, this is Mèngzǐ developing it in his own way, but in a way that is quite consistent with Kǒngzǐ. When I say that all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the sufferings of others, my meaning may be illustrated thus. And here we have one of the most famous passages in Chinese philosophy. If you read writings on empathy, I happen to work on empathy, be working on empathy a fair amount recently. And it's a passage that writers on empathy, American Western writers on empathy often quote. It's a very famous passage. If men suddenly, even nowadays, if men suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will without exception experience a feeling of alarm and distress. They will feel so not as a ground on which they may gain the favor of the child's parents, nor as a ground on which they may seek the praise of their neighbors and friends, nor from a dislike to the reputation of having been unmoved by such a thing. So in other words, if you're walking along and you see like a big, a well isn't an ideal example for us, but suppose there's like a manhole on a city street and the big metal cover has been removed because they're going to be doing some work in the sewers or something. But the little blockade they put around it, so people don't fall in, has not been put up. And you see a toddler running toward the hole and they're soon going to step into it. Your immediate impulse, I think Mèngzǐ is right about this, everybody's immediate impulse would be to rush for the child to stop the child from falling in the manhole. Because, anybody'd be injured badly in doing that, but a child could fall and break his or her neck and die. It's very serious. And the idea of a well would be very deep and would be filled with water, and the child would probably drown before anyone could get the child out. But of course, you wouldn't think about any of this, nor would you think about any instrumental function, any instrumental benefit saving the child would have. You wouldn't do the sort of thing that Xúnzǐ says we always do. You wouldn't say, well, I guess if I go and save the child, if its parents are rich, I'll get some money for this, or maybe I'll get my name in the newspaper. Passerby saves child from death with my picture. You don't think that. You just, you might want it afterwards. After you save the child, you might go, well, I should have my picture in the newspaper. But that wouldn't motivate you to do it. Your immediate response would be to rush to the child to try to stop the child from falling in. And that's that sort of spontaneous empathic response is because it's totally unmediated by reflection, is, in Mengzí's opinion, what is most clearly representative of our nature. And thus the case that is most clearly representative of our nature is a case of complete selflessness, is a case of not thinking about your ego at all, but thinking only about the other person and feeling deep distress that this child might be injured, and doing whatever you can to prevent the child from being injured, again, just as a natural impulse. Let's see, where was I? From this case, we may perceive that the feeling of commiseration is essential to man, that, again, to human beings, that the feeling of shame and dislike is essential to man, that the feeling of, modesty and complacence, I don't know where he's going with all this stuff. Yeah, I'm just going to reread the beginning of that because I had forgotten the passage goes on to extend to allow him to introduce other moral virtues that he sees as deriving from empathy, but that I'm not going to focus on because, frankly, I'm not sure how he derives them from empathy. Some of them it's clear how he derives them from empathy, but okay, let's see, where was I? From this case, we may perceive that the feeling of commiseration is essential to man. So essential means that it's part of what defines us as human beings, what can't be removed from us. It can only be layered over by a sort of falsity, a sort of self-misunderstanding or self-misrepresentation. And then skipping to the next sentence, this feeling of commiseration is the principle of benevolence. And benevolence there is Ren, humanity, the fundamental virtue of Rushui that we discussed before, and that Kǒngzǐ does connect with Shu, thus empathy, but that Mengzǐ really develops the connection, extends the connection, elaborates on it in passages such as this. So we've really kind of run out of time here, and I was supposed to take less time today because I had taken excess time in earlier classes, but maybe we have 2 minutes left if I take the whole time for this class period. Let's take a quick look at 13 and 15 of Yang Hui Wang. Oh, cripes, it must have been Liang Hui Wang too. Yes, it was. I used up most of one of the minutes just looking this. Oh, yeah. Well, we have less than a minute left. I'm not going to read through these because it's just taken too much time, but do try to look at some of these other passages where Mengzǐ basically confronts kings. This is, again, this is pre-Qin, so it's pre-emperor, pre-imperial period. That's why they're kings rather than emperors. But he basically confronts kings with his empathic pleading for the rights of ordinary people, and his harsh criticism, his he admonishes in good Confucian fashion, admonishes the rulers that they will lose the mandate of heaven and be subject to just overthrow if they do not behave virtuously, and behaving virtuously means behaving compassionately toward ordinary people. Okay, so we'll have to go on to Taoism next time. So I guess that's it for Mèngzǐ. And do I have the? Let me check to make sure. Do I have the? Yeah, I have the link to Xúnzǐ here. You can get the Xúnzǐ through the Yukon's library. It's online. So if you just search for Xúnzǐ online, you'll be able to look that up if you want to read some Xúnzǐ. Particularly look at chapter 23. That's where he says, I think it's an exact quote, human nature is bad. And he's pretty blunt about it. Or maybe it's, yeah, I think that might be an exact quote. So, but you can find it in chapter 3 of that. And so, as I say, next time we'll go on to Taoism, and maybe next time I'll refrain from going over time, because I've accumulated almost 15 minutes, about 15 minutes of excess time over our ordinary weekly class times thus far. Anyway, so I won't say see you next time, but until next time, bye-bye.